the good old summertime, in the good old summertime, rolling through.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of this episode on the marvel that was C.B. Fry, with my special guest, Fry's biographer, Iain Wilton. My name is Tom Ford. Don't forget to listen to part 1 to hear Iain discuss Fry's early life, his writing and batting style, and his relationship with his wife, Beatrice. A large asterisk that has always existed next to Fry's name has been his meeting with Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, and how he never quite disassociated himself from the horrors of the Holocaust. How do you explain this relationship today?
I think it's one of those things that you have to see in the round. I think probably the first thing to say is that C.B. Fry had sort of demonstrated a fair bit of political naivety when he was standing for Parliament in the 1920s. And that political naivety, I think, endured right through the 1930s, up to and including the period when he went to Germany. And he wasn't the only person to, I think, prove to be really gullible in his dealings with the sort of Hitler regime. Most obviously, David Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister, went to Germany and he was impressed by what he was shown and spoke favourably about it afterwards. And he was someone who normally you would regard as very politically astute and hard-headed. So he made serious mistakes there, which have obviously negatively affected his reputation. And likewise, C.B. Fry, a much less sophisticated figure politically, did the same. So it's absolutely not to his credit that he made those mistakes. I think one point I would make in his favour is that he had that meeting, that visit to Germany in the sort of mid-1930s, not long after he'd emerged from this sort of 6-year period of seclusion and acute mental illness. Then he went to Germany and then he wrote in those sort of unwisely positive terms about it in Life Worth Living, published as the Second World War approached. And he shouldn't have done that. He should have revised his opinions in the meantime. But in a sense, there is an element of honesty, which I suppose you have to admire, might be too strong a word. But yeah, he wrote in sort of 38, 39 about the perceptions that he sort of hit him about Germany in sort of 34, 35. And he didn't change his words to take account of subsequent events. Again, I think that's a sort of naivety on his part. He should have done. He should have realised more what was going on and changed his verdict and his words accordingly. He didn't do that, and he's paid a heavy price for it reputationally. And certainly his daughter-in-law said to me that she thought that one of the reasons why he didn't get honours in public life subsequently was because of the visit he'd undertaken and how he'd written about it in the late 1930s. A couple of things there. One is, a number of people have written, was he, in a sense, some kind of pro-Nazi or a Nazi sympathiser? Was he, as one person even made a claim that C.B. Fry was at risk of being interred in the 1930s as a sort of Nazi sympathiser? And I think that's wrong. And in particular, I think that's wrong because of a film evening that was organised by David Frith, the great cricket historian. And he'd found something at the Imperial War Museum, and it was a film made in about 39 or 1940. And it was a sort of official government propaganda piece. And to my amazement, it was C.B. Fry interviewed at the Mercury, lots of footage of boys at the Mercury playing cricket and doing other stuff. So certainly the British government view of C.B. Fry at the time was, he wasn't someone who epitomised, German values, Nazi values, anything like that. On the contrary, he viewed this sort of propaganda film. He was a representative of, Britain, Britain's finest, fighting spirit, independence, and so on. So I think that was significant to see that. That was really significant. I think it was a really low-profile film that, David found with his sort of characteristically thorough research. So that made me think that the sort of, if you like, the official establishment or government view of C.B. Fry hadn't been that negatively affected by the visit to Germany or what he subsequently wrote about it. But yeah, he did pay a price for it. I think that's one of the reasons why he didn't get the honours that might have come his way in later life. I think another really important fact to bear in mind is the First World War and what happened to his brother. Now, when I wrote the book, I knew very little about his brother, but discovered more and more about it as time went by. And in particular, there's a great book I read by someone who wrote about the experience of British prisoners of war in the First World War. We know a lot about the experience of British prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war in the Second World War. Films like Great Escape shown every Christmas in the UK, for example. But I read this book about the experience of Allied prisoners of war in the First World War, and it was a real eye-opener. And in particular, there was a reference there to a Major Fry from the Royal Army Medical Corps and what had happened to him and a bunch of his colleagues. And it's a terribly, terribly sad story. But basically, CB's younger brother Walter was in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was captured early on in the First World War, probably by about December 1914. And not long after being captured and held prisoner, he and a bunch of Royal Army Medical Corps colleagues were told, well, would you be willing to go to a prisoner of war camp where, amongst others, we've got, there are Russians, there are French prisoners, and there are British prisoners. Would you be willing to go and help them, meet their medical needs? And Fry and his colleagues said they were happy to do that. And then they're on the train to go to this camp called Wittenberg. And it's only on the train that Walter Fry and his colleagues get told there is a big typhus outbreak at this camp, and there's virtually nothing in the way of medicines or medical equipment to help anyone who's looking to assist the prisoners of war there. And the conditions are appalling, genuinely appalling. And Walter Fry goes there, gets shown around the sort of, particularly the British prisoners of war and their conditions. And there's an official inquiry into this episode in this prisoner of war camp later on in the war. And it says, black and white, Walter Fry went into this and he came out and broke down because of what he'd seen, the conditions in which the British troops were being held, the sort of lice infestations, and lice apparently just transmit typhus really, really quickly. Gangrene sets in. The conditions are just absolutely appalling. And without any sort of proper medical equipment to protect them or to treat people, Walter Fry catches the disease and he dies within a matter of weeks or a couple of months. And it becomes a very notorious episode in the First World War. As I said, there's an official British government or British Army inquiry into what happened, and it is called, from memory, The Horrors of Wittenberg. Now, some reports written and published at that time might be exaggerated, perhaps, for propaganda purposes, but a lot of what's in there comes across as very factual and very, very, very grim indeed. And that is, it explains how and why Walter Fry died in the First World War. And so there must surely be at least an extent to which C.B. Fry is conscious of that, conscious of the way he's lost his only brother. And so maybe that might explain why in the 1930s he's so determined to pursue the sort of rapprochement between Britain and Germany, as were so many other people. And it was the official policy of the government at the time, later disowned. It was the official policy of the national governments, Baldwin and then particularly Chamberlain. So maybe that explains to an extent why C.B. Fry was willing to do the visit to Germany, to have actually some boys from the hippie youth visit the military subsequently. But yeah, what he wrote and what he did, with benefit of hindsight, doesn't look good. But I think it does need to be seen in the context, particularly what happened to his brother. And also, let's bear in mind that when he went to Germany, this was not long after he'd been in seclusion for 6 years, at this sort of huge period of mental illness. So I think there are, allowances you can make, not excuses, but I think there are allowances you need to bear in mind who he was, the family experience that he'd had, and the acute mental illness that he had before he went to Germany. But I think fundamentally, as he'd shown earlier in his career, he was politically very naive, and so he reached some very flawed judgments and made the mistake of writing about them perhaps too honestly when he did in research. But
So Fry had many faults as a human, as we know, many eccentricities, and he was prone to nervous breakdowns. But as you interpret in your book, he was also clearly suffering from some form of mental illness, something which just wasn't easily diagnosed in his day. Um, Firstly, how did you come to this conclusion? And should this change our modern assessment of his character today?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I discovered as a result of the hardback being published. So I put in a fair bit about all that I knew about his mental difficulties at Oxford, and then his breakdown, his fuller breakdown in the 1920s. And one of the great things about the hardback was then someone came back to me, who had impeccable medical credentials, and he said, "Okay, from what you've written, this is what I think he had, and this is how it would be treated now." And it was a form of depression, acute depression, and it was a form of, I think, bipolar disorder as well. So for C.B. Fry, life was, never grey. It was always, either technicolor with the highs, or it was very dark and black with the lows. And as I've indicated earlier, I think he had, some of these problems first manifested themselves at Oxford when he faced a variety of pressures, not least financial. And then there are sort of signs of things not being quite right at various stages in his county and international cricketing career. But yeah, they come to a head in the 1920s, and that's when he sort of disappears from public view for about 6 years. And it's interesting. I mean, a couple of reasons why I sort of got attracted by the subject of C.B. Fry in the first place were a couple of things I learned sort of from my grandfather. I actually met him, so I heard this from my mum, her dad. And two things. One is that my grandfather had been in the crowd once at Southampton when C.B. Fry was playing for Southampton as the only amateur in the team. And someone from the crowd shouted out to him, "Fry, you're the biggest pro of the lot," sort of confirming this thing that he was a shamateur. And the second thing I heard was that my grandfather had bumped into C.B. Fry in, I don't know when exactly it would have been, but it was in the New Forest. And I found out during the course of my research that one of the people who could get through to C.B. Fry in the sort of late 20s, early 30s, when he had this really serious mental illness, was a guy who was the head teacher, headmaster, it would be called in those days, of the school in the New Forest. And so my grandfather had bumped into C.B. Fry when he was on one of these visits to this guy who could get through to him, and who seemed to have a sort of calming influence on him during that period of acute mental illness that he had. So that's the sort of family connection that led me to C.B. Fry. And yeah, it's helpful. It provided a couple of insights to him, the sort of shaman thing, but also to the extent of the mental health difficulties that he had, especially.
Well, let's turn our attention now to slightly happier subjects. Let's return to his cricket statistics. And they're fascinating to pore over for a multitude of reasons. So sit back in. I'll read these through. Jump in if you want to. We can discuss them afterwards. So C.B. Fry made his Test debut in February 1896 in the first Test of a 3-match series in South Africa. It was a match made famous for George Lohmann's 15 wickets for the match. And he made his final Test match appearance, as you mentioned earlier, in that triangular series in August of 1912 versus the Australians. At a lower level, at first class level, his career spanned from 1892 until 1921-22. So quite an extraordinary long first-class career. You mentioned earlier how he came back after the First World War for a handful of first-class matches, no Test matches though. If we look at the actual numbers, I'll just briefly go over the bowling figures because we can't forget he did do a bit of bowling. It's not really what he's remembered for. He bowled 10 balls in Test cricket for a total of 3 runs. At first class level, he took 166 wickets for 4,872 runs. Best bowling, 6 for 78. A question without notice, Ian. What sort of bowler was was he? Was he a medium pace bowler, a spin bowler?
I think from memory he was sort of medium brisk. But
Right.
obviously the thing that he's sort of most remembered for is the sort of questionable action that he had, is why he sort of starts off as an all-rounder and then ultimately becomes, like you say, a sort of specialist batsman because his action is very much sort of frowned upon increasingly over time. He's regarded as a
Right.
thrower, gets no balled frequently. So that brings an end to his bowling career. Although one of the things that sort of, on rereading the book, that I was sort of struck by in a way that probably hadn't hit me before was the gap between his bowling average, I think it's about 30, and his overall first class average, which is just over 50.
Mm.
That's a hell of a gap because you always say that if your batting average is better than your bowling average, that's a sign of a good all rounder. And if it's like 5 runs better, 10 runs better, that's a seriously good all rounder. But I don't know whether many people have actually got the sort of the net plus 20 that CB Fry had, batting average of 50, bowling average of 30, based on, a not insignificant number of first class wickets. I think 166, you said.
Mm.
I'd be interested to know what other people think and what figures they can put forward about people who've got all-rounders who've taken, minimum of 100, 150 first class wickets and who've then ended their career with a plus 20 gap between their batting average and their bowling average. But it's pretty impressive.
I'm sure someone is listening who will no doubt be able to tell us. So please write in if you do know. So if we turn our attention to his batting, I'm going to actually start with the first class figures. So he played 394 first class matches, batting 658 times for 43 not outs, scored 30,886 runs with a high score of 258 not out. So his average first class cricket was 50.22. And you mentioned earlier, fell 6 centuries short of the 100, so 94 centuries, 124 half centuries, and he took 239 catches. Now, in the Test arena, he played for England 26 times, batting 41 times, 3 not outs. He scored 1,223 runs with a high score of 144, an average of 32.18. So the average at first class level is 50, it drops to 32 at Test level. So 2 centuries he scored in those 41 innings and 7 half centuries. So, Ian, I'm going to pose this question to you. 94 centuries, which I think at the time of the First World War was the third most behind W.G. Grace, of course, and Tom Hayward. But he just couldn't seem to transition the first class form, which was often extraordinary form, like form first class cricket had ever seen before. He couldn't quite transition that into the Test arena. And there's this great imbalance between his first class and Test record. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a number of factors for it. I think first and foremost is the fact that he did suffer from nerves. There are a number of contemporary articles that refer to him being quite highly strung, and in particular, he seemed to struggle early on. So he could settle, he could then get more confidence and play well, but there are a whole number of instances where he got out quite quickly because he was nervy, scratchy, and liable to that early dismissal. He tended to once he settled, then he could play a lot better. And some of the best innings that he played were regarded by his contemporaries as extremely good innings. And as for his first class career, a lot of people would say he could score runs on wickets that other people just couldn't cope with. I think there was an example in the triangular tournament which we talked about. It was terribly, terribly wet summer. There was a wet wicket, and he'd mastered it in a way that no one else could. And I think CB Fry, from memory, gets out. Tiger Smith, the England wicketkeeper, comes in and he says to Smith, just effectively hang on in there. And Smith's view was, no, I don't want to hang on in there. I want to get out. I want all my teammates to get out as quickly as possible. because we want to get the Australians in on this pitch as soon as we can, because it's such an awful batting surface that Fry might have been able to cope with it, but no one else can. So he did actually get out for a naught. I think several other of the England lower order, whether by accident or design, got out very quickly as well. They got the Australians, I think it was, into bat, and England wrapped it up quite quickly. So that sort of showed CB Fry at his best. But yeah, I think you're right. When you have as big a gap as 50 to 30 between your first class average and your test average, then it does mean that people are going to say that suggests a batsman not of the very, very highest class. And I think there are comparisons we can make with players from the more recent past, like Graham Hick, who just scored runs for fun in county cricket, but found test cricket much, much harder thing to cope with. And I think remember players like Merv Hughes trying to sort of rough him up, not only with the ball but with the glares and everything like that, because they sort of felt that temperamentally Graham Hick wouldn't enjoy that, and that would affect his performance. So I think CB Fry was the same. I think he did struggle mentally when he was out of the middle from time to time. And so it's one of these things, like we were saying earlier on. I think there are a number of things. He had this extraordinary sporting career, but there are just a few things where you wish he'd done things just slightly differently, because then that would put him just out there ahead of anyone else. So if he had got the FA Cup winners' medal, that would have been the sort of crowning glory on his footballing career. Likewise with cricket, if he'd got the 100 hundreds, and likewise if he'd actually made a better fist of Test cricket, and I think if he averaged late 30s, 40, no one will be querying whether he was a genuine Test batsman. But I think, if you look at the overall scores that he had, the weight of runs that he scored, the record numbers of centuries, double centuries, etc., and also all these sort of contemporary reports saying how he could cope with attacks, and particularly with wickets that no one else could really master. That does suggest that he, despite the modest Test record, he was a batsman of very, very high quality. I was just, again, rereading the book the other day, and I came across a section. I think it might have been a Sussex versus Leicestershire match, something like that. And I was amazed by what I wrote, which said that not only did CB Fry score as many runs as all his teammates put together, but in this one match he scored as many runs as everyone else in the match put together. I mean, that's an extraordinary feat. And then again, you look at particularly like the double hundreds and the 6 successive hundreds, things like that. These were, truly extraordinary feats. And he had some amazing years, and there were other times when sometimes he was playing cricket, but then sometimes he was writing, sometimes he was running the Mercury. He was a bit in and out. He didn't have the opportunity to devote himself to cricket as fully as he might. Had he been able to do so, and had he been able to do those Australian tours that we were talking about earlier on, I think you'd undoubtedly be talking about someone who got 150 plus first class hundreds rather than the 90 that he did get.
It's quite extraordinary. And just on that point, I want to actually read a section from your book. It comes from page 461, because the statistics, or the numerical statistics that I read out before, don't do justice to all of his achievements. Because, and you touched on it just briefly there's an extraordinary number of feats he achieved, which perhaps are largely forgotten today. So I'm just going to quote you from your book. You wrote, "He achieved a number of feats which had been beyond every other batsman in the history of the first-class game. As a century maker, for instance, CB's record was truly historic. He hit more centuries in a season than anyone else. He created a new record by scoring 100 in each innings of a match on no fewer than 5 occasions. And he achieved the unprecedented feat of following a century with a double century in the same game. He also hit more first-class double hundreds than any of his predecessors, even though they included figures as illustrious as W.G. Grace. Moreover, Fry established a new world record by scoring 6 successive centuries, twice as many as any previous batsman, and a performance which, over a century later, is still unsurpassed." And of course, it has that last feat, the 6 successive centuries, has been equalled by 2 other batsmen, and it took someone like Don Bradman to equal it. So it really does put his astonishing first-class feats into context when we think of what he achieved, but what he achieved really as a pioneer. No one had done this until he did, and unfortunately it's largely forgotten today.
Again, also rereading the book, I was struck by the number of occasions where he also got 100 in one innings of a match and then would get 90 something in the other. And I don't know whether that was nerves, like we talked about before, whether that's nerves afflicting him when he got into the nervous 90s. But yeah, he did get a sort of record number of 200s in the same game, and he came close on a whole bunch of occasions to doing it even more frequently.
Now, following his playing career, Fry remained involved in cricket as a writer, which you've already spoken about. What can you tell us about his post-playing involvement in the game and how it progressed from the playing field to the writer's box?
I think you have that sort of gap between him finishing playing in sort of 1921, 22. Then there's a sort of period of sort of disengagement with the game, quite a long period of disengagement with the game, because there's this lengthy period of mental illness. But the extraordinary thing is then when he comes back with a bang, writing about cricket in the C.B. Fry Says column in the Evening Standard. And it's a bit like when we're talking about him writing about conditions in Australia where he'd never actually played. You have him writing about players like Bradman in quite an informed way, and I don't think he'd seen Bradman before 1934 when he's writing about him in the Evening Standard. But yeah, he has that confidence to just immediately pontificate about a player or sum a player up or offer some real insights into the sort of player, his character, or his technique. So I think that, again, like we were saying earlier, I think it reflects his supreme sort of technical understanding of the game, but also this confidence that he can write confidently and make judgments about people he's never really seen before. But it works brilliantly because as we were saying previously, C.B. Fry Says column is a great success. And so yeah, you have this extraordinary record of C.B. Fry as a writer from it starts in the 1890s and goes through to the 1930s, and it covers everything from his magazine to his autobiography to his front page columns of the Evening Standard. And I just don't think anyone else played the game has really matched that record. And I was particularly struck actually by something I read about C.B. Fry Says column when someone pointed out that he ceased being the England captain in 1912. He then comes back to write C.B. Fry Says from 1934. So he's getting the job on the Standard 22 years after being the England captain. So it's not like he's trading on immediate or recent glories. He's doing it on the basis of his ability, I think, as a writer. Yes, there's an enduring reputation, but it's really through his merit as a writer. And the remarkable thing is that C.B. Fry Says column is unlike anyone in Britain, I think, has read before. It's an entirely new type of sports writing. And he masters it at that sort of late stage of his life. He masters that complete new form of writing. And it's a brilliant success, a late life success.
I was really shocked to read in your book, Iain, how he was grossly snubbed in his lifetime from the Sussex, Hampshire and MCC establishments, possibly because of his eccentricities. Has there been a correction since?
I think when I sort of reflected on this and thought, well, why didn't he have these sort of honorary posts really at Sussex, which he left quite acrimoniously, Hampshire or MCC? And yeah, each of them probably should have done more to recognise the contributions that he made to the game. But I do actually sort of sympathise with the people who are on the Sussex committee, MCC committee or Hampshire committee, because I think he would have been a very difficult committee man, if you like. By the time he was sort of well into his retirement from cricket itself, he had become rather eccentric. He had developed a real liking for the sound of his own voice. So I do think that he would have been a difficult person to have on some of those committees. I think he would have, not only did he bat for him, but I think he could have talked for him in those committee rooms. So I think he might have been a difficult person to to have on that kind of role. Maybe he'd have been better as some sort of figurehead rather than as an active committee member. So I do understand, I think, why some of those sort of honours didn't come his way. There was a sort of little bit of a sense of readjustment at MCC actually when I worked there, because Charles Fry, his grandson, became the chairman of the club and then the president of the club, and then perhaps not surprisingly, that was the point at which a portrait of C.B. Fry, a very good portrait of C.B. Fry in later life, came into the committee room. So C.B. did get into the MCC committee room, but in portrait form rather than in real life form. But that was a sort of a measure of respect to the man. Also, Wadham College commissioned probably 15 years ago now a painting of C.B. Fry that sort of was given reasonable pride of place in their sort of dining hall, and myself and the family were kindly invited by the college to go up to a dinner that sort of marked its unveiling. I didn't think it was as good as the portrait of C.B. Fry that hangs in the sort of did hang in the committee room at Lords, but it was nice to see Wadham College honouring C.B. Fry in that way.
One final question, Ian, and my listeners will know I like to end each interview with this line of question. What would C.B. Fry think of modern cricket today? Would he enjoy, for example, day-night cricket, T20 and women's cricket, or would he hold on to the traditions of the grand old game?
Goodness, that's a really big and a really hard question. I think women's cricket he would have been quite positive about, and there's a photograph in the book of CB right towards the end of his life at Lords coaching, I think it was the visiting New Zealand women's team, and so that indicated a degree of positivity about women's cricket at that stage in the early 1950s. So I think he was ahead of the game there probably. I think he encouraged his daughters from memory to play cricket, so again there's that sort of positivity about women playing the game. And as we've said earlier, he could be a real innovator. We talked about the way he changed batsmanship by playing more off the back foot, playing more onto the leg side. Also an innovator in terms of his role in bringing the triangular tournament about. So I think there are lots of things that he would have been, there's a lot of these innovations that he'd been quite receptive to. But some of the others, I wonder whether Bazball would have quite been up C.B. Fry's street, for example. I think maybe not. I think he would regret things like, the decline of Oxford v Cambridge and stuff like that, those sort of very traditional fixtures. I think he would miss them. But I think there was an innovator in there. Yes, a sort of gentleman amateur and a traditionalist in some ways, but an innovator as well. So I think it's quite hard to judge which way he'd have gone on some of these things, but I do think on women's cricket, probably yes, he would have been very supportive.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and for returning to the subject of C.B. Fry. Your book, C.B. Fry, King of Sport, is a truly exceptional biography of not only the cricketer, but the man as a whole. A reminder to anyone listening that Ian is currently researching about the first Cricket World Cup from 1975, and he'd love to hear from anyone connected with that first tournament. Ian, thanks again.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks very much indeed.
That's all from me for this episode. Don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter and YouTube and explore previous episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. My name is Tom Ford. Bye for now.